Who were the Vikings? The years 793 and 1066 AD were called the Viking Age. Bold men who, with bloody axes and tattooed bodies, were moving from the frozen lands of the north to Africa. The name of this bold people is recorded in history with blood, soil, wine, women, adventure, and money. A people who cut off heads and broke legs and did not forget any revenge because they were Vikings. Make no mistake, this story is not just the story of the Vikings, but the story of all humans. But how did they disappear in a strange way? If you're ready to travel 1,200 years ago, let's start this video. Before watching this video, be sure to become a member of the channel and click the subscribe button and support us by liking this video and continue to stay with the Secret Box channel. April 30, 793 AD, a typical Viking village in Scandinavia. In this village, everyday life goes on as usual. The people of this village are working hard to make a living. But what were these Vikings really like? What was their goal, and how did they change the world? The Vikings were divided into different groups. The Vikings were very good drinkers, so much so that they considered drinking until their defeat and downfall a sign of masculinity. And they were lawless men who dueled while drunk. The Vikings' desire and passion for fun and entertainment was so great that this desire and passion was even reflected in their understanding of heaven. According to the Vikings, brave warriors who died in this world would become guests at Odin's table in the other world, and their days would be spent drinking and dueling with their friends. But this reward only applied to brave heroes who died in battle. Those who died peacefully in their beds went to hell, which, according to the Vikings, was cold and dark. For this reason, it can be said that the Vikings' desire for war was rooted precisely in their religious beliefs. Another important part of Viking society were slaves, who had almost equal rights to animals, and each Viking had several slaves. The slave class consisted of women and men who had been stolen from distant lands, and a quarter of the Viking population consisted of these slaves. The slaves lived alongside animals and worked under very difficult conditions in all seasons of the year, so that a Viking survival and sustainability depended on the sufficient exploitation of animals such as pigs, sheep, and cattle, and the planting and harvesting of gardens that he either owned or rented. All of this work was done by the slaves. That is why the slave trade was very important to the Vikings. Small and large groups of Vikings who easily moved on rivers with their ships, attacked villages and cities, took spoils and kidnapped people for commercial purposes. Women and children who roamed freely in the plains, thinking that these Vikings were just ordinary traders, were the easiest prey for the Vikings. One of the main sources of livelihood for the Vikings was the slave trade, and they had created a network of slavery from Scandinavia to Baghdad. In Viking homes, the management and organization of slaves was the responsibility of the woman of the house, who was responsible for managing the housework. In the season when the Vikings' men were looking for spoils and money, women were the only ones who managed this whole system. Viking houses were usually prefabricated structures that were covered with grass or dug into the ground and had only one door. Due to the climatic conditions, Viking houses had only one room, and the inhabitants of the house warmed themselves with a fire that was lit in the middle of the house. Of course, we must distinguish between Viking women. Viking women had much more rights than other European women. For example, we know that among the Vikings, there were female warriors who participated in wars alongside Viking men. Furthermore, a Viking woman had the right to divorce her husband, and if a Viking woman had not married by the age of 20, she could determine her own place of residence and was accepted as a full-fledged person before the law.
Viking priests were also usually women. When the chieftain of a Viking tribe died, his body was often burned along with his ship, and slave girls who'd been voluntarily or involuntarily selected were also burned and killed with their chieftain. Sometimes human sacrifices were also made for other reasons. Before a campaign or at a funeral, slaves were selected and their blood was shed, and the warriors rubbed this blood on their clothes and faces. Sometimes slaves were burned alive. The entire ritual was mostly led by women, and they had been doing this since childhood. They were covered in blood, but they were also the cleanest people in Europe at the time. The Vikings took bathing very seriously. Bathing was a religious necessity for them because, like other pagan societies, running water was sacred to the Vikings. Also, if you were a Viking, you probably felt a sharp pain in your stomach because there was almost no knowledge of food hygiene at that time. This caused people all over the world to have more or less intestinal worms. In short, the Vikings always had an itchy feeling inside their bodies. Today, there are still various debates about when the Vikings left Scandinavia. Among the theories put forward, the increase in population and the decrease in food resources and the lack of concubines and mistresses for Viking men who had multiple wives stand out. And Viking men could have as many concubines and mistresses as they wanted in addition to their wives, but Viking women did not have such a right. At that time, the Vikings built the best ships. Ships that reached speeds of 20 knots were the fastest ships of the time, but they were also among the heaviest. Sailing ships without roofs and protection in storms, in snowy and icy weather, was both difficult and made the crew sick. Like other sailors of the time, the Vikings were forced to defecate and urinate at sea. In addition, the Vikings did not have a compass. However, they could determine the direction of the sun, even in cloudy weather, by using a crystal stone called a sunstone, which doubled the light. The sunstone was one of the greatest discoveries of the time. The year is 860 AD, and a Viking force of 200 ships is approaching Constantinople from the north. The Vikings and the Eastern Romans, the Byzantines, aren't even aware of their existence. They will introduce themselves to the Byzantines in the most brutal way possible. The city will be burned and destroyed. The Byzantines will be killed with axes hung from the ships with nails. Thousands will drown alive in the sea. The Vikings used to hang the heads of their enemies from their ships to create fear and terror, and this method was quite effective. At the same time, the Byzantine army, which was fighting the Arabs, had no choice but to watch the Viking raids. After weeks of raiding, the Vikings returned north to their homeland with ships full of loot, leaving behind only blood and suffering. The Byzantines called these unknown invaders Rus or Rus, which meant northern sailors, and the word Russia is derived from this word. But despite all these events and bad relations between the Vikings and Byzantium, over time a good relationship was formed between them, so much so that after signing agreements, the Vikings were allowed to freely use the baths and to obtain as much bread, wine, meat, fish, etc. as they wanted from the city. They now felt safe in Byzantium, of course only as merchants. The Byzantine emperor, who had learned a lesson from what had happened, forbade them from entering the city armed, following an agreement with the Vikings. He was so impressed by the courage of the Vikings that he even chose a group of protective warriors from among the Vikings. While some of the Vikings were engaged in trade in Constantinople, others were preparing to travel further west. The Icelandic chronicles contain a detailed account of how the country was discovered.
The famous Viking explorer Floki left Norway and set sail with his family to explore unknown lands. Although he was not the first to discover Iceland, he was the first to settle there. The story is interesting. Floki took 3 ravens with him on his voyage in 868. He released the ravens into the sea, and the first raven went to an island they already knew, while the second raven returned to the ship. But the third raven did not return. Floki and his group arrived in Iceland following the flight path of the third raven, and because the first thing they saw was the icy lands, they named the place Iceland. Later, the Icelandic Vikings, including a group led by a man named Eric the Red, moved to Greenland, and he founded the first Norse colony in Greenland. Their subsequent generations, following further west, were the first Europeans to reach the American continent 500 years before Christopher Columbus arrived in the Americas. The first Viking settlement can still be visiting on the coast of Newfoundland, Canada. But it is interesting that the Vikings abandoned this village, which had fertile land, for no apparent reason. It is not known why the Vikings left this village. Many believe that they left this village either because of attacks by natives or because they continued their journey to the central regions of America, but there is no significant evidence as to why they left this village. During this time, the situation in Europe was very complicated. Great kings emerged from among the Vikings who had become rich and powerful, and this caused armies of 4,000 to 5,000 men to replace the small bands of warriors and adventurers of the Vikings. France, England, Spain, and Eastern Europe. In fact, they were the scene of war and bloodshed. The rivers that ran through Europe made it easier for Viking ships to sail, which led to constant and sudden attacks by the Vikings on various regions. In 845, Paris was not immune to these attacks. It is said that an army of 4,000 to 5,000 Vikings under the command of the legendary Viking king Ragnar used boulders to pull their ships ashore to plunder Paris so that they could pass over chains stretched across the Seine River. According to historians, Ragnar Lodbrok was not just an ordinary king, but a legendary figure who probably lived in the 8th century and marked the golden age of the Vikings. The combination of the two words Ragnar Lodbrok, as a name first appears in the texts of an Icelandic author in 1120, almost 3 centuries after the lives of the characters in question. In short, by examining historical data and legends, we can understand that Ragnar was actually a legendary figure who is formed from the combination of famous Viking kings about whom we know little. So, how did the Viking Age end? In 1066, a Viking commander named Harold the Hard conquered England and became king, but he was defeated and died by another king named William the Conqueror, who was also of Viking descent. And this is considered the beginning of the end of the Viking Age. But not everything was over yet. From the year 999, Viking groups called Normans established a large kingdom in Italy. The Normans, the Vikings who were enemies of the Byzantine Empire, were even praised by the Pope. But changes were taking place. At the same time as the construction of large castles in the cities of Europe, the power of the nobility was also increasing. Christianity was also becoming the main religion among the Vikings. This made them part of Europe. But in all these years, almost all the kings of European countries were Vikings. In fact, William the Conqueror was the first Viking conqueror who completely conquered England, which transformed Europe. And the Vikings, who had become Christian and had fully accepted the culture of the countries they inhabited, were no longer the same Vikings. They maintained their warrior qualities for many years, so that commanders of Viking descent who were also Christian kings participated in the Crusades. And as the Vikings were integrated and absorbed into new cultures, their stories gradually disappeared.
The old kings considered themselves English, French, Spanish, or Italian. Instead of excitement and tables full of wine, Odin's heaven awaited them. At the end of this exciting adventure, some of the Vikings returned to their homeland, Scandinavia, where they began a new life full of memories and stories of the past. Only small groups, trapped in a primitive world among the forests and ice, managed to maintain their faith, and thus one of the greatest adventures in history that a people was capable of creating ended. The Vikings were not defeated by their enemies. Swords and spears did not destroy them either, but they themselves destroyed themselves by rebuilding Europe. Now only their stories remain for us, stories of memorable people worth remembering. Thank you very much for being with us until the end of this video. If you like these sample videos, be sure to like the video and share it with your friends, and be sure to write your opinions in the comments section. Thank you.